I'm Ann Dart.
I'm Tracy Stormy.
And I'm Kathy Knight.
And together we are
It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club,
a podcast for mystery lovers.
Welcome. Hello and welcome to the first 2019 episode of It Was a Dark and Stormy Book Club. We just finished with all the holidays. We hope you had a wonderful one like we did. We're looking forward to a lot of exciting things happening this year.
I hope you enjoyed our update episodes that we used as a filler for our end of the year to give us time to spend with our families. We have lots of new books to read based on those.
Yes, we do.
But on today's episode, we are going to have an interview with Brad Ricca, who is the author of Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. This is a little different than our other books because this is not fiction.
Based on a true person. Brad Ricca is the author of Mrs. Sherlock Holmes. He's the winner of the 2014 Ohioana Book Award for Nonfiction and a 2013 Top 10 Books on the Arts by Booklist. He won the St. Lawrence Book Award for his first book of poetry called American Mastodon. His film, The Last Son, won a 2010 Silver Ace Award at the Las Vegas Film Festival. Ricca is also a winner of the 2014 Cleveland Arts Prize for the Emerging Artist in Literature. He was born, lives, and works in Cleveland, Ohio, teaching classes at Case Western Reserve University on writing and comic books.
And he also is quite busy with his growing family. At the release of this, his wife was just getting ready to give birth. So we wish them all the best.
And new baby, welcome. And we hope you enjoy Brad Ricca. We would like to welcome Brad Ricca to our podcast. He is the author of Mrs. Sherlock Holmes, The Life of Grace Humiston, somebody you've probably never heard of, but you will by the end of this podcast. Welcome, Brad.
Hi, thanks so much for having me on.
Now, you wrote about many of the cases that Grace worked on during her lifetime. Which cases stuck out in your mind as the most interesting and frustrating to research?
That's a good question. I think the one that really still sticks with me was the Sunnyside Plantation case.
Oh, yes.
And that still sticks with me. And it's been a few years now since I wrote it. And I don't want to, spoil it too much for people who haven't read the book, but what it comes down to is she goes on a detective trip to the Deep South and uncovers what's essentially a cotton plantation that is being worked at by slaves decades after the Civil War. In this case, it's Italian immigrants who were brought in and are kind of stuck to work there. And it's just a really haunting case and really just shocking to know that this was going on so long, like I said, so long after the Civil War, and really kind of sets the table for, I know we're going to talk about human trafficking later, but really kind of started that off and highlights this process of Americans still bringing in people from other countries, a lot of times against their will, to do our work.
It was heartbreaking. Well, the indentured servant process started, I guess, in the 1700s, and it was kind of shocking to hear that it was continuing, as you said, past the Civil War and the supposed abolishment of slavery.
Yeah, because, that's always pointed to as our greatest sin as a country is slavery. But we supposedly got over it and made amends. But this case, shows that no way. I mean, there were still people willing to go to all kinds of ends for cheap labor, the expense of the human condition.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I found it very interesting how they would, even once they were there, they were told they were going to get this money, but then with all the fees, they made nothing. And
they wound up owing the money back to the company.
Absolutely, the company store. And that was very eye-opening.
Yeah, it's evil.
Yes.
It's just straight up evil, and these people worked for generations and couldn't leave. I was able to find out a lot about them, surprisingly, but it's still, that's of all her cases, and all of them are in their own ways like really unbelievable. That's the one that still kind of sticks with me, that how could this happen?
Was there a lot of information available?
Yeah, there was, because she wrote a big report that she sent to the president, President Roosevelt, and it kind of, if you read the book, he, agreed with the report, but ended up putting it on the shelf for a variety of reasons. So I had this report, and I had some other government documents, but the best thing I found was the church is still there. The church that the Italians used, the plantation is long gone, but the church publishes a cookbook, and, kind of an annual thing to raise money. And in this cookbook are all these old recipes and tons of old pictures dating way back, right to kind of right after Sunnyside was disbanded, and some are even older. So I found all this good firsthand information about what it was like to live and work there.
That's really neat.
Yeah, you find stuff in the weirdest places.
Well, in your book, you also mentioned that John D. Rockefeller was asked to investigate the matter of white slavery in 1910. And at the close of his investigation in 1913, he said he found no evidence of a vast network or organization, but that it was more of an individual situation where individuals were enticing or kidnapping girls and drugging them and forcing them into white slavery. And they all kind of knew each other. 100 years later, there are still reports of human trafficking and, activists working to eradicate it. And the statistics you cite at the end of your book are they're heartbreaking and they're infuriating. Why do you think there hasn't been any progress or much progress in 100 years?
Wow. If I knew the answer.
If you knew the answer, yeah.
Yeah. I'm so glad you said that. I feel bad about infuriating you, but I also secretly don't, because that would have been great, I think, to write a book that had hope in it, or, that things had changed. But once I realized that things haven't, I wanted that to be really one of the main themes. That why am I reading this book from 100 years ago about a woman from 100 years ago? Well, because nothing has changed. I think the hope is that she fought against it, but the problem's still there. There's that great quote you read, the finding from Rockefeller, and it's typical kind of politics that it makes no sense. He says, well, there's no network, but it still goes on. So unless nobody talked to each other and nobody knew each other, there had to be some kind of network. And I think we find that in the book with the Sunnyside stuff, even though that's, for a different kind of work. I think it's one of those things that white slavery, and certainly back then they gave it that awful, really scary word. It scares people. They didn't want to scare people, but it was certainly going on. And now we call it human trafficking, which I think is more clinical and maybe not as scary, and maybe it should be scarier. But we know now that it does go on. It goes on in our backyards, in every kind of neighborhood. A rich suburb or a poor neighborhood, there are people being trafficked in and out.
Absolutely.
Well, there's always going to be desperate people, and there's always going to be people who take advantage of desperate people.
Yeah.
Oh, that's sad.
Yeah.
And it's very sad.
And it's easy to live in a bubble where you kind of, what's going on, but
You turn a blind eye.
yeah. And I think
Right.
things like this do shine a light and help. And speaking of that, you did a great job of shining a light on how women were treated in this era. During the case of Ruth Cruger, Grace was someone they could try and manipulate, but when she got too close, they turned on her. And now there's actually little information on her today. But I thank you for actually shining a light on women and the suffragettes, and just a comment, but
No, that means everything. I think it's always a challenge to write about a situation so far away in time, and much less a different gender and a different experience and all that stuff. But like you said, it made me really mad once I started reading about Grace, how much she was kind of erased from history. And it seemed to me that doesn't happen just by itself. I completely agree with you that a large part of this was the police, who were angry at her for solving the Cruger case, angry at her for being a woman and solving the Cruger case, and all these other people were angry at her just for being a successful woman. I think that's a large part of why we don't know very much about her today.
Well, that was part of my question. We don't have a lot of personal information about her. Why do you think that is? I mean, she didn't even leave a will.
No, and that's still so shocking to me. I mean, she was the ultimate lawyer in so many ways, and yet she didn't leave a will. So, and I know this goes to one of the other questions too. It was very difficult. I found almost nothing about her when I first started researching her. And I thought I would, because in her time, she was the most famous detective, one of the most famous detectives in the country. And I thought she would have letters, and she was a lawyer, she would have her records, but there was nothing. And at one point, I pretty much gave up. I said, I can't write this book. But then I realized that the only way I could write it would be to write it about her work instead of her life. And then I realized that maybe it wasn't just the police and the government who had tried to keep her out of the history books, but that maybe it was herself as well. I really do believe that she foregrounded the work above everything else, and her life was her business. And I think there was a reason for that I hint at in the book, and I can't say what it is for sure. I think it's a little bit obvious. I've had people come up to me after and say, oh, it's totally obvious. She wanted to keep her life private for possibly a number of reasons, and that just kind of opened the whole thing up for me, because I love Sherlock Holmes stories. And one of the best things about those stories is you get to know so little about Sherlock himself. And it's frustrating because you wanted to know his story because he's the most interesting guy in the room, but you end up just hearing about the case. So I said, okay, I can make this work.
Well, you did a wonderful job. She was reported about quite often in the New York Times or the newspapers of the time. And it didn't seem like she really relished that.
Yeah.
She would use it to her advantage on occasion.
Well, and I also think that, isn't that the way she would have wanted it, though? She'd want the work to speak. No, she wouldn't have wanted the spotlight on her. She would probably love this book.
Oh, I think so.
Oh, that's great.
I think she'd like this book a lot.
Well,
I totally agree. Again, she liked poking into other people's business.
Yes, she did.
Well, didn't want people poking into hers.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's true of most of us.
Yeah.
The police department officials seem to have been using Mrs. Humiston to help solve some of their hairier cases, but then they took kind of the credit for themselves and left her accomplishments unreported and unappreciated. How do you think this would have been different if the public and press were aware of this practice?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think certainly if she was working today, things would be a lot different. I think that one of the other things I wanted to do with this book is show how a lot of police practices have not changed. There's really great and excellent people who work in police departments, and then some people who do, things we wish they wouldn't. And we see that with her, is they, just like you said, they take a lot of the credit for stuff that she does. And sometimes you wish she would fight back a little, but she just seems to say, well, the case is solved. I'm not going to worry about this nonsense of credit. I mean, like you said, she got a lot of press coverage, but I think it would definitely be different if there was even more of it, or if it even happened today. But again, this was, 100 years ago, things were, as much as we say they were very similar, which is kind of scary. Mm-hmm. It was different in a lot of respects, that some of that press coverage was just because she was a woman and because it was kind of interesting and quaint. I mean, not all of it. I think a lot of people, it's a long way of saying a lot of people, I think, didn't give her credit for the things that she did.
Absolutely. But, I can't help but think about what Grace would think of organizations like the Innocence Project and DNA evidence. I think she would have just relished in that stuff.
Oh, yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see, she works with a lot of other organizations, the book, that help victims and help shine a light on crime. I think she would have